it's not necessarily that uncommon for young people to be accessing, a lot of violent propaganda from terrorist groups, not necessarily because they're sympathetic to terrorist groups, but just because terrorist groups have such a monopoly on violence online. I think your average person would be quite shocked by how common it is. I mean, even when I was in school, people, there were kind of crimes, like war crimes videos going around on Nokia 3210s, believe it or not. And I think that David Anderson Casey is got a long and extensive background and familiarity with counterterrorism and with Prevent. It's going to ensure that the review recommendations from 2023 continue to be implemented. But also the bigger, obviously, the massive question out of the Southport atrocity is, is Prevent set up to deal with this type of thing, or even should it be set up for this type of thing? I think that's the big question that needs to be answered by this review.
Yeah, that really is the question that everybody is pondering at the moment, because well, look, we're still finding out all the details, but it doesn't look like you could neatly put him into one box in terms of one ideology.
Yeah.
So how do you think, what do you think needs to happen? Do you think the definition of terrorism needs to be expanded, or how do you think Prevent can pick up people like the killer?
Yeah, well, to answer the question about definition, I don't think that's a good idea at all. I think there's no. Well, it's a kind of a cliche at this point to say that there's no universally accepted definition of terrorism. Every country has its own definition. There isn't, an international definition. There's always going to be flaws. There's always going to be things it doesn't cover. But we do have a pretty good definition of terrorism. But the other problem is if you expand it to this type of crime, then you're still going to need another word and another definition to cover the kind of politically, ideologically motivated types of violence, because that is a completely different kind of, I know they're all public spectacles, but it's a completely different type of violence to the kind of school shooter, the Southport, this kind of, as Keir Starmer put it, violence for the sake of violence, the completely different stripes of violence. And I don't think you can have one definition that covers all of it, and certainly not. Terrorism isn't terrorism just because it terrorizes, as some people suggest. So I don't think that's the right route to go down. There is definitely a question of whether Prevent needs to encompass these type of violent incidents. They are. I know that the Southport atrocity is kind of viscerally shocking, but they are also very, very rare. So it's a big question of whether there's enough caseload there for Prevent to expand into this type of thing. Although having said that, recently the Met Police and the Five Eyes intelligence, so the kind of US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, UK, they all warned about this kind of increasing type of violence. People who are, fixated with violence online, downloading a lot of material. We haven't necessarily seen it come to fruition in terms of real world violence yet. But it is something that is obviously on the horizon and in the foremost of the consciousness of security services. So it's worth reviewing just the question of whether there's enough there to have a kind of a new response.
And as you say, it's this new, well, it's probably not new, but the thing that we're talking about is this violence for violence sake. You've got a lot of young people who've got massive amount of access to very, very violent content on social media. They may well also have mental health issues as well. How can the state, I suppose, whether it's Prevent or something else, or social services, mental health services, schools, how can the state adequately monitor and track and help or prevent these kind of individuals, Liam? Because that is the question that seems so. The state cannot go around, policing every boy's bedroom in terms of what they're watching. So what, just on a common sense level, what can be done?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, and that's what is kind of difficult to. I understand that it's difficult to swallow and accept when you see, as I said, how viscerally shocking this atrocity was in Southport. But it's not necessarily that uncommon for young people to be accessing, a lot of violent propaganda from terrorist groups, not necessarily because they're sympathetic to terrorist groups, but just because terrorist groups have such a monopoly on violence online. I think your average person would be quite shocked by how common it is. I mean, even when I was in school, people, there were kind of crimes, like war crimes videos going around on Nokia 3210s, believe it or not. Obviously, that's massively accelerated with access to the internet. But as I said, it's not that uncommon. It's also not uncommon for, as in the case of Ruda Cabana, that there were several violent incidents, cases of carrying weapons. These are actually the type of referrals that, your average local authority will be dealing with almost on a weekly basis. So knowing, separating those kind of referrals from the people who actually will act in the real world is enormously challenging, and I'm not going to pretend to have the answer for that. But it is also why it kind of makes me nervous to think about an alternative to prevent that's set up just for this type of crime, because it is so rare, and because and that takes nothing away from how desperately awful Southport was, but it is so rare. And as we saw with Prevent, and as the review found in 2023, I mean, the last thing we want is this kind of industry and sector to pop up around this, and it become, go down this route of mission creep and another big bureaucracy dealing with this, what is ultimately an extremely rare incident.
And the other thing with Prevent is that, I mean, this particular killer didn't look like he had a specific ideology, but
Mm.
there have been other cases, the terrible murder of David Amos, where the killer did look like they had an ideology, and it didn't feel like Prevent picked them up. I think they engaged a bit with Prevent. Do you
Mm.
think Prevent is strong enough, or is it quite easy to game the system if you're interacting with Prevent? Because you Prevent can't compel people.
No. Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, Prevent doesn't have any statutory power to, force people to accept any kind of intervention. Yeah, I think the question, what sometimes called in the industry disguised compliance, is what you kind of hinted at there, of like gaming the system. We've seen that certainly happen in prison environments where people have been made to undergo like de-radicalization interventions and mentorship with ideological intervention providers. All across Europe, there's cases of people kind of gaming the system and just, going along with what's said. I mean, you could make that case that that's what happened with the Fishmongers Hall attack as well. But yeah, ultimately, it comes down to the fact that there is no way to compel, as you put it, people to engage with Prevent. And in the case of Rudder Kobana, I know we're kind of screaming out to say that this maybe is a Prevent failing, and I'm no partisan of Prevent. I think I've got a million and one criticisms of it. But ultimately, was it fulfilling its purpose? If there was, it doesn't seem that there was an ideological or political motive to this, and that's what Prevent was set up for. So it's not necessarily. I think there's a bunch of different failings here, but it's not necessarily a Prevent failing, if that makes sense.
And so, where do you think that the failings were, or where do the gaps exist? Because a question that keeps going through my mind, and my listeners have been messaging in about this. We had a bit of a sort of discussion about this on Friday. Clearly, there were signs that this individual was starting to display very disturbing behaviour. We know his dad had stopped him getting in a taxi the week before. What should his parents have done, or the school, or who should he have been referred to? Should he have been referred to social services or mental health services or the police? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, look, immensely difficult. I mean, like we've discussed. I mean, there's obviously this referral came in about Rudder Kobana 3 times to Prevent. I think a couple of them were years before his attack, so we've got no idea what his behaviour was like at that time, and to what extent it spiraled in the years that followed. But I mean, they decided that there wasn't a political or ideological component to it, so it wasn't necessarily something Prevent, but handed it on to broader social care, potentially mental health services, general safeguarding services. But I mean, and we hinted at this in the last question and answer, but even if there was a kind of full wraparound package put into place for Rudder Kobana, I mean, what does that look like in real terms? Maybe, 1, 2, 3 interactions with state services a week. I mean, there's no guarantee that that's going to prevent him doing what he did.
Mm.
I think the bigger question for me is there's still a lot of information missing around the times that he was stopped with knives, the times that he was involved in violent incidents with classmates in school, like you mentioned, with the father stopping him getting in a taxi. What was known at that point, and potentially why was something that wasn't voluntary done, if that makes sense. So Prevent, social services, mental health, but it's not clear that there's a mental health issue here. Those are all voluntary things. You can't force somebody to engage with them. But it does seem that potentially several different crimes were committed here. Why wasn't that intercepted in a non-voluntary sense?
And look, just in terms of the mental health issue, I mean, his defence did not raise a mental health, issue in terms of diminished responsibility or anything like that. But I mean, I would argue clearly there's something not right with somebody that goes out and does something like that. And when you look at um, a lot of these murders from David Amos to others, there is, one would argue there is a mental health component to that. How does the system deal with that side of things as well? If you have a fragile mind and if you have a mental health issue, presumably you may be more susceptible to being radicalized and this kind of violence. Is there a way that something like Prevent better links up with mental health services?
Yeah, I think that this is something, with my own dealings with Prevent, and even a few years ago when I was working on it, the potential link between mental health and radicalization has definitely been something that's been explored for a long time. I think as this and the David Ames murder case shows, it's not necessarily very easy to delineate. You can't put it necessarily in a mental health box or otherwise. And I mean, yeah, there's presumably during the arrest and during the court proceedings, there were mental health assessments, and they don't seem to have found something. I think, as you or I would say, well, surely this person is disturbed, but it's difficult to define that in like a mental health condition. But look, in terms of what Prevent can do, I think that the potential for mental health in radicalization is definitely something on the radar, and also the ability to pass it on to mental health services is definitely embedded within Prevent. But yeah, like I said, if it's not exactly clear what the mental health risk is, that can be immensely difficult to pass on, and it all comes back to everything, the kind of common thread in all of this, that ultimately is voluntary.